So hello again, and thank you for joining us on the webinar today. This is being presented by Bramwell Biomedical. So we are, just a bit of brief background, we are a regulatory consultancy firm. We are based in Sydney. We've got offices in New Zealand and Beijing, but we also manage global regulatory submissions with particular expertise in the Asia Pacific. Last week was actually our 15th birthday, so we have been providing these services for 15 years now, and it has been quite a nice journey. So that's a bit of background to our company. And without further ado, I'll get straight into the agenda. The agenda for today is firstly understanding the Australian regulatory model and its European origin. So we'll be going through a brief background about the Act and how it aligns with the European model, and why this then allows manufacturers to obtain approvals based on CE certification. We'll then have a look at the TGA, so the agency and the legislation. Following that, we'll look at some local differences. So as much as you will see some jurisdictions aligning with the regulations, there always will be some local differences. And there are some important differences for Australia and Europe, and we'll be going through that today as well. Yep, we'll then be going through the responsibilities, and this will specifically talk about the sponsor and manufacturer responsibilities and what their role is in Australia for holding the device registrations and licenses. And finally, we'll go through the process, so how you can actually register your product in Australia and what's required, and just a bit of update as to what has changed and what are some of the upcoming changes. Okay, to begin with, I'll just go through a brief overview of the European regulatory model. Basically, there are a set of elements that define or characterize the European model. And the first one is the essential requirements. Basically, what this is, they're statements. They set out high-level requirements for quality, safety, and performance of medical devices. You would be familiar with the essential requirements checklist, and it basically has the requirements for meeting your safety and performance of the device. You then have standards as a means of compliance, and basically you can use standards sometimes to, many of them will be internationally recognized. Europe has a rules-based classification, and basically there's a classification rules depending on the level of risk of the device. And following from that, regulatory intervention based on classification. And as the name suggests, the lower the risk, the lower the scrutiny, I guess, and high-risk devices are subject to higher regulatory intervention. And then you've got post-market vigilance. Now, this European framework was the basis for the GHTF model. Basically, it was just taken, the European framework was taken, it was added and refined, and it was used to produce a bunch of guidance documents that have been adopted by TGA. And as a result of that, we've got the Australian regulatory model, which is very similar to the European model, we've got the essential principles instead of the requirements, and basically the key elements of that model is also adopted in Australia. Okay, this is just an introduction as to the TGA as an agency. This is the location of the TGA office, so it's in Canberra. And basically it's a nice building. It's surrounded by a lot of farmland and a lot of park there. A bit of information as to internal structure of TGA. It actually has, TGA has about just over 500 people working perhaps, and less than 100 of those people work in the devices unit. We often have a lot of clients who ask for timelines for medical devices, and sometimes we can see backlog of applications, and sometimes they're quick, so there are some peaks and troughs as to the application timelines, and it's primarily related to the limited resources in the devices sector. One notable difference between Australia and Europe is that TGA acts both as the competent authority and the conformity assessment body. So these are basically, in Europe, however, they are quite separate. The competent authority is a member state in the European Union, and the conformity assessment body is actually the notified body, and they carry out the conformity assessment procedures on the device and the manufacturer. And just a bit of trivial fact, I guess, is TGA does have a very strong scientific culture. This was once a laboratory building, and we can see this culture sometimes reflected in the review questions that we get, which are quite technical and they're very scientific. So it sort of does reflect from the scientific culture, as it was once a laboratory building. Next on, so the TGA organizational structure. So TGA separates its pre-market and post-market functions. What you have is the high-level management in red, and your pre-market sector for the medical devices lies in the Office of Device Authorizations. So this is where all the device applications are assessed and reviewed. Then on the other sector, you've got the Office of Product Review, which looks at post-market. And this is basically the post-market vigilance. And there's a deliberate organization to separate those two departments, because TGA does not want to have any bias for the pre-market and post-market. They want to make sure that they are looked at separately, so those two departments often don't talk to each other. Okay, just a high-level overview of, I guess, the structure of the regulation. In Australia, you first start off with the Act. That is the legislation, pretty much it's the law. And a subordinate of that is regulations, and they go through the detail of the regulatory framework. So the Act, which is legislation, it was set out in 1989, so it is quite old, and it sets out the legal requirements for importing, exporting, manufacturing, and supplying the medical device or therapeutic goods in Australia. So following from that, the regulations, they go through more detailed reg framework, so they're the subordinate of the Act. And then you've got the external documents, and they're your orders, guidances, and methods, standards, and pharmacopoeias. Many of these are internationally recognized. And that's just a simple pyramid structure. If you'd like to know any more information or actually obtain or have a look at the Acts and the regulation, this is the link to it, and it actually contains the legislation and the Acts. Extracted here is the contents page of the Act, and this was just to draw your attention that a big chunk of that section is dedicated to medical devices, and you could see from the list of contents page some similarity to the requirements in Europe, in particular with regards to essential principles, which is the essential requirements in Europe, the conformity assessment procedures, and requirement to include, in Australia, there's a requirement to include your device in the register prior to supply, and we'll go through that in a bit more detail later. Okay, this is now the therapeutic goods regulation. So as I mentioned, it's a more detailed of the regulations, and in here, what I'd like to draw to you is that the difference between Australia and Europe is that in Australia, the medical device regulation covers both the implantable and IVDs. So the active implantable medical devices are incorporated into the classification rules, and the classification rules is what's used to distinguish between the AIMDs and the IVDs. There are 4 new IVD rules, and basically by separating them through the classification rules, they can then determine the conformity assessment pathway and the requirements required for both of these. And again, I'm just highlighting including the medical device in the register, so we'll go through that in a bit more detail later on. Okay, so the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, this is a public database. It basically contains all of the devices that are approved for supply in Australia, and many of you will be familiar with this, ARTG. And as is mentioned there, it's the primary point of control, and it's a legal requirement that a device must be entered on the register before it can be legally supplied, unless, of course, there's an exemption rule applied to it. And the way it works is that all devices are grouped as kinds of medical devices, and that's the term that's used quite often to describe a group of devices which share certain characteristics. This includes the manufacturer, the sponsor, the GMD and code, classification, and intended purpose. So essentially, if the group of products share the same manufacturer, sponsor, GMD and code, classification, and intended purpose, they can be regarded as the same kind, and they can share one ARTG certificate to cover the group of devices. Obviously, it will have to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, so sometimes you can't have a device that significantly varies in design aspects or key biological or technical characteristics, but in general, it is the same kind if it shares those characteristics. And this is normally the case for classes which are 2B and low. For class 3, there is an additional requirement to have the same unique product identifier. So if for class 3 devices to be of the same kind and to share the same ARTG entry, it not only has to have the same manufacturer, sponsor, GMDN code, classification, intended purpose, it must also have the unique product identifier. This is just for your reference, some summary of the fees and charges. Now, this was updated just on 1st of July, so new fees have come into place. And listed here are just application fees for the different class of devices, as well as application audit fees. And we'll go through the application audit a bit later on in the webinar. Okay, so as mentioned, while the European and Australian regulatory framework do align, there are some unique differences, and this is particularly the case for classification differences. And the first one is with regards to products that are in contact with the central circulatory system. Now, Australia and Europe have a slight different definition of the central circulatory system. In Australia, it includes the common iliac arteries. This is usually applicable to devices such as aneurysm stents, where they could be classified as class 2B in Europe, but they're actually class 3 in Australia. And what normally happens in these cases is you would be able to go through a device application and use the notified body audit report in lieu of the certificate. However, there is always, if TGA does accept that evidence, then they will add the requirement that it must be listed on the design examination certificate. So this particular difference can cause a bit of hassle because sometimes notified bodies might be hesitant to include class 2B products on the design examination certificate, but TGA may grant approval and set a rule or set a requirement that they would like to receive the design examination certificate with those products included within a certain time frame. But that's one of the examples of differences in classification between Australia and Europe. The other one is with regards to disinfectants. So in Australia, all disinfectants are classified as class 2B. However, in Europe, it's only the case if the disinfectants are for invasive devices. Devices of microbial or recombinant origin, so they are all class 3 in Australia and often have to go through direct TGA conformity assessment as opposed to SEEE certification, and we'll go through the exemptions a bit later as well. And all devices that are in contact with the central nervous system. In Europe, it is all class 3. However, in Australia, it'll vary depending on the duration of contact. So it may vary from class 1 to class 3, depending on how long it is in contact and obviously the nature of the device. And these are some examples. There are actually more differences, and they can be found in the ARGMD. These are just some specific ones that have been pulled out for this webinar, just to show you that there are some classification differences for some group of products. As well as the classification difference, there are also some differences in how you document and how you present your documentation. And the first one is the Essential Principles Checklist. As mentioned earlier, in Europe, it is referred to as the Essential Requirements Checklist, but at TGA have their own. It uses the GHTF checklist, and it's referred to as Essential Principles. And again, there are the specific differences between the two are detailed in the ARGMD. It's publicly available, but as an example, usually for example, say clinical evidence, it's moved in the essential requirements from 14 to 6. So, and also there's some cross-referencing and some minor differences in terms of labeling and instructions for use. In Australia, in the Essential Principles Checklist, they have defined the specific length of a character to be on the labeling. And it's these sort of differences that you have to take into account. Usually this can be approached in two ways. You can either retain your essential requirements checklist and cross-reference the requirements to the essential principles, or you might have to do a new essential principles checklist just for the Australian submission. So as explained earlier, the Australian classification, so some devices will be different, and examples were provided in the earlier slide. The Declaration of Conformity. So TGA have their own Declaration of Conformity, and they will not accept that from Europe. They won't accept a European declaration. There are templates available, but basically you have to submit an Australian Declaration of Conformity. And lastly, it's the Clinical Evaluation Report. In Australia, it is a requirement that the report be written or at least endorsed by a clinical expert. As opposed to this, we have also noticed, and just in our experience when handling these applications, TGA is quite picky about the presentation of their clinical evidence report. And we have had cases where manufacturers have obtained their CE mark and their CE certificate for a Class 3 product. And when it comes to applying for TGA approval, they've submitted their clinical evidence, and what was approved by the notified body and is not actually accepted by TGA. And in most cases, I mean, usually TGA don't reject it in the first go. They will come back with a series of suggestions and a series of deficiencies they've identified in the report. So presentation and contents of the clinical evaluation, we have seen differences, but the key change is that it must be signed by a clinical expert. The clinical expert here, and we've had a few questions and confusions about this, it doesn't, a lot of people ask, does it have to be a surgeon or does it have to be a clinician? And the answer to that really is maybe. There are two key factors to take into account, and that is the qualification of the person. Are they qualified appropriately to the device and where it's used, and also their experience. Are they using the device, or are they qualified and have the experience to know how a device works and whether it'll be safe and perform as intended? Okay, so in here, before we go into how to register products on the ARTG, I'm just going to go through some products which are not required to be listed on the register, on the ARTG register. These are sort of devices that are exempt. And the first batch is those products which don't have any TGA assessment of safety. And the first one is devices that are intended to be used for clinical trials. So there are usually two pathways to notify TGA if a device is to be used for clinical trial. The first is a clinical trial exemption scheme. What this requires is a direct TGA assessment of the protocol. There is a lot of fees and there's a lot of time required for this pathway, and it's usually used for high-risk medicines. And this pathway requires engagement with the TGA as you develop the process. And the advantage, I guess, for this process is that while you're spending a lot of fees and times on this, it does increase the likelihood of subsequent approval. However, the other method is just the clinical trial notification scheme. And basically this one is when the manufacturer or you basically develop the protocol and you get hospital ethics committee approval. And that's done without telling TGA, but there's an additional form that must be submitted to TGA, and this is just a notification. So all you're telling TGA is that it's a notification of conducting clinical trials, and it might be a few $100s. And again, this is actually the most popular method, and it's how things have been done to date from our knowledge. So as I mentioned before, so these devices which fall under the clinical trials are for investigational use only. They're for research or to gather clinical data to support a subsequent TGA application assessment. The next group of devices exempt from entry is those who are eligible to go through the special access scheme. And there are three categories: the SASA, SASB, and authorized prescriber. With the SASA, it's usually for emergency cases. So a clinician can use an unapproved device and then gain approval for that device later if there's an urgent need to use that for a patient in an emergency case. The other one, the SASB, it's for not immediate emergency, but it's for those where patients need the device, but the clinician has to get approval by TGA first. And what normally happens is a correspondence between the clinician and the TGA, and TGA can approve that device and it could be used for the patient in need. And the third option is the authorized prescriber. And basically under this pathway, TGA can authorize for a device to be used for a particular patient. The authorized prescriber is a medical practitioner, and they are only allowed to prescribe that product to their patients in their immediate care. They're not allowed to give it to any other prescribers. It's basically products supplied by that clinician or that medical practitioner to their patients under their direct point of care. And they are responsible for reporting to TGA on the number of patients treated on usually it's a 6-monthly basis. And as mentioned before, they're generally humanitarian exemptions. In terms of the SASA, it's an advanced access to a new technology. And SASB is when approval is given to a device and then it could be used to the patient. And authorized prescriber, it's only for patients in immediate care of that medical practitioner. The last category, which is a little interesting, is those that are used for personal import. As I said there, it's a unique regulatory peculiarity where a person can import any device, except of course if it's a poison or narcotics, if it's for their personal use and they could use it at their own risk. And these 3 categories don't require any TGA assessment of safety. The next big category of devices are those which don't need to be registered on the ARTG, however, they must meet safety and performance requirements. And these include custom-made devices, and typical examples are dental crowns or braces. They're manufactured individually to a clinical prescription or a named patient. And the other class is exempt goods. So they are very low risk and usually they're not worth TGA or anyone's time to review and be included on the register. And they're things like hospital bedding, protective equipment, and conventional toothpastes. And as mentioned before, they're not assessed by TGA. They are exempt from being included on the ARTG. However, they must still meet safety and performance requirements, and they are also subject to post-market monitoring. And finally, ARTG inclusion. So everything else must be registered on the ARTG before they can be supplied in Australia. And these are Class 1 to Class 3 and also active implantable medical devices and also IVDs, Class 1 to 4. And as mentioned there, they are subject to TGA assessment, and the scrutiny, the level of scrutiny or assessment increases with the classification. The higher the risk, obviously the higher the regulatory assessment required. Okay, so as mentioned, and the point of the webinar is to show that TGA conformity assessment uses the European model. Before we go into the device application process, this is just a flowchart of the assessment procedures in Europe. And you might be very familiar with this, but it's used as a guidance for what classification your product falls under and what conformity assessment route or pathway it requires. And basically, each of the annexes map out to the regulations in Australia, the Australian Therapeutic Goods Regulation. And this is a good reference, and this is how it's based on the European model. And as a result of that, TGA accepts CE certificates in lieu of Australian certificates for most devices. Basically, if your product has an EC certificate and is a proof of supply in Europe, that certificate can be used to gain approval in Australia as well. So before we go into how to register a product, there is a requirement for every device to have an Australian sponsor. This is the Australian authorised representative. The requirement is that it must be an Australian company. It may be a third party, so it's one of the services that we offer, and we do actually act as a sponsor for many of our clients. It could be a regulatory consulting company such as us, and the advantage to having, if you don't have an actual office based in Australia, and most manufacturers are just overseas, and it's not a requirement. They don't have to actually set up an office in Australia. You can get a third party to act as a local sponsor, and manufacturers choose to do it one or two ways. They can either appoint consultancy companies such as Bramwell Biomedical, or they can assign it to the distributors of the product. And there are some certain advantages and disadvantages to each way. The advantage to having a third party, such as a consulting company like Bramall Biomedical, is that the manufacturer is free to establish their commercial arrangements with distributors independently of registration. So they can change their distributors or they can change their commercial arrangements. And because the registration license is under a third party, it doesn't affect those licenses. However, if the manufacturer assigns the sponsor responsibility on the distributor as well, then if there's any need to change the commercial arrangements, then they will require the cooperation of the distributor. And this can get, some cases we've seen manufacturers, they have to go through the whole device application process and re-register their device under another distributor. And that's where it can get a bit messy. So there's advantages to having third party. And the last thing, the sponsor and the manufacturer, they must have a contractual arrangement, because a sponsor is obligated to provide information to TGA on demand, and that's why there must be a contractual agreement in place with the manufacturer to supply any information that's requested by TGA at any point. Okay, so now I'm going to go through how to actually register the product in Australia. Starting off, there are three entities involved in the registration. The first is a manufacturer, and they can be located anywhere around the world. The next is a sponsor, and they must be based in Australia. And then there's TGA, so obviously the government body based in Canberra. The manufacturer holds the CE certificate. It holds the technical file data for the device. They're responsible for determining the Australian classification of the device, and they must have declared to the Australian Declaration of Conformity. They must have a signed Declaration of Conformity in place. And all of these lies within the manufacturer. Once all of these documents are in place, the sponsor submits the CE certificate to TGA. And this is an online application. It's called the Manufacturer Evidence Application. It's online, and it's basically an application where TGA verifies the certificate, verifies that it is accurate, and checks the details and that the certificate's valid. So it's more of an administrative sort of application for this one when the CE certificate is applied. And once it is verified, the TGA check the certificate date and they check the number, and if the certificate's all good, they issue what's called an accepted manufacturer evidence. And this is the first step required before going through the actual device application. So once the manufacturer evidence is accepted, the sponsor can then go and make the ARTG application for the device. And again, this is also an online application that's done through the Business Services portal. Once the device application is submitted to TGA, TGA make an assessment, and for classes that are less than class 3, so class 1 up to class 2B, it may be TGA have 20 working days to either ask further questions and submit an S4 and request under the S41JA request, or the ARTG can be approved. They have sort of like a random audit for those kind of applications, unless it's a class 1, which is self-declared. Once the ARTG entry is obtained, then the device can basically be legally supplied in Australia. So I mentioned before that for classes up to class 3, so anything below that up to class 2B, it's sort of a random application audit that happens with TGA. So there's a chance the application can be picked up, but there's a chance it might go through. However, it doesn't apply if it's a class 3 or if it's implantable and active implantable. Or for these devices, they must go through a mandatory application audit. And there's key documentation requested by TGA for these products. That's your risk assessment, your clinical evidence, and your labeling and information, such as IFU that's supplied with the product. And once submitted, and this is when I mentioned before about the clinical evidence requirement. So while a manufacturer can have a CE certificate from their notified body, the application process in TGA could be delayed if the clinical evidence is not in the shape that meets the requirements in TGA. And that's when the application, that's all assessed in the application audit. So if the application order is successful, then obviously for Class 3, he'll have an ARTG entry and then legal supply in Australia. So yep, if it's selected for audit, for all other classes, the other documentation requested is a Australian DOC, and the technical file data, as mentioned, it's usually the risk assessment, the clinical evidence, and information supplied with the device, such as IFU and labeling. So there are some exclusions to the CE Fast Track. There are specific classes of devices which cannot be supported by EC certificate and must go through TGA assessment. These are Class 3 with an integral medicine, which also requires a TGA medicine assessment, and Class 3s with biological components, and these include recombinant products, blood products, and some low-risk exemptions such as gelatin. There is actually a specific list that's in the ARTG, it's publicly available. Basically, the devices that contain tissues and cells and all these products, they must undergo TGA Conformity Assessment certificate. And that process is usually a lot longer, and obviously it's quite expensive as well. But again, it's because of the nature of the product, it's high risk and incorporates these elements. The TGA want to assess them themselves directly. Okay, so just some of the changes that are coming ahead now. If you'd like, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter, or you can follow our blog on our website. There's a links over there. But I know there have been quite a few changes since the previous webinar was delivered. It was last year in January, and I'm just going to go through two particular specific ones, two sort of significant ones. One's very recent. It's the ACE scheme, which replaces the low value turnover exemption scheme, and this affects the annual fees and how TGA basically want to start managing the annual fees. And the requirement now is that whenever a device application is made and an ART and a device is approved for supply, TGA will assume that there is absolutely no turnover. So there's no more low value, there's just zero value. And every single product that is approved will automatically be under a zero. TGA will assume there's zero value turnover. If there has in fact been a turnover for the next financial year, then the sponsor must notify TGA. If there's still zero value turnover, it's the obligation of the sponsor to notify TGA. Otherwise, TGA will assume that there's been turnover and they'll charge the annual fee the following year. So it's based on the whole point of this is to reduce their administrative efforts, and the change no longer requires accountants and evidence to support or to show that you've had low value. It's basically a simple online declaration from the sponsor that says that zero value turnover has been made on these products, and then once received, TGA don't charge annual fees for that particular one. However, if no declaration is received, TGA will assume that there's been turnover and annual charge will be applied. And the second big change that we saw was basically the Australian government allowing local Australian manufacturers to use CE certificates in lieu of TGA conformity assessment. Previously, under the exemptions category was also Australian manufacturers, and this meant that regardless of your product, if you manufacture the device in Australia, you must go assessment by TGA. And recently the government has changed that rule, and basically now it's allowing Australian manufacturers to also use a CE certificate to supply their products in Australia, and that has cut a lot of time and also money and effort for Australian manufacturers, so they're on the even level with overseas manufacturers. As I mentioned, there are more updates, so we regularly post these regulatory updates on our blog, on our website, and every month, so first Tuesday of the month, we send out a monthly newsletter. And if you'd like to keep up to date with the regulatory changes, I recommend you subscribe to our monthly newsletter and also have a look at our blogs online. So that was the end of the webinar. It was intended to be a very simple overview of how to register a product in Australia, and I hope it has been useful. Now, we do have time now for questions. I'll leave about a few minutes to gather the questions. So if you've got any questions there, just type them in. As I mentioned, if I don't get a chance to get to your questions, then we will follow up directly via email following the webinar. So I'll give a few minutes to collate the questions. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the questions. The first one I've got here is how similar is the New Zealand medical device acceptance process to the Australian? Okay, so you would have heard an announcement earlier. Well, there was plans to merge the two regulatory entities together under the ANSPA, which obviously has halted, and that's not progressing. The main difference is that New Zealand accepts certifications from FDA, so overseas certifications from FDA and obviously Europe and Australia. However, Australia does not accept US or FDA approval. Australia only accepts the European. Yes, that's the primary difference between the two. The other question I've got is, it's a quite good question. So for a manufacturer, if they already have a TGA Conformity Assessment certificate and also an EC certificate, what should they do following the change? So that's a good question. Now, from the last slide when I mentioned that the new law allowed local Australian manufacturers to basically use an EC certificate. Now, the answer is you don't need both. You only need one now. And the recommended approach, the recommended strategy is to keep the EC certificate, only because we do find it's a lot easier to deal with the notified bodies, and it's easier to just have it under one certificate. And if you want to use your EC certificate instead of your TGA, you will need to do a variation to your manufacturer's evidence. So that was the first step that was described earlier. Basically, you submit an application to your manufacturer's evidence, you attach your new EC certificate, and you must also email TGA at their device conformity assessment email. It's a DCAS from memory. You must email them and notify them, let them know that you no longer wish to use the TGA certificate, you want to use the EC certificate. And they'll be able to transfer that to your ARTG entries. And that's important to do because then it removes the need for TGA to do any audits or assessments later on. Okay, the next, I've got a question here. How long does it take to get TGA approval if you have a CE certificate? So again, with the timelines, you can get a bit, there's no a distinct answer, but it is a much quicker process than going through TGA. So if you go through TGA conformity assessment, it is a lot of time and cost involved. And as I mentioned before, TGA have limited resources in their devices, so there are a lot of lot of timeline, and if you go through TGA, if you have a CE certificate, then it is a much quicker process. But when we talk quick as well, again, it depends on the resources of TGA. If you go through TGA, you have to go through two departments, conformity assessment, and once you've got that, you go through devices. But if you've got an EC certificate, you can go straight into your device application. So it is a much more fast track, but in saying that, it could take from a few weeks to a few months, depending on the resources. And also, if the application is selected for an audit, then there's additional questions asked by TGA, and that again can add the time. But compared to TGA conformity assessment, it is a much quicker process. Okay, there's a question that says, what should we do in order to be recognized as a sponsor by the TGA? Basically, there's an agency form. You just complete an agent client details form or an agency form. And what that form has, it's available online. It's got sections for who's the manufacturer, identifying who's the sponsor, and who's an authorized agent who can act on behalf. And you just basically fill that out with the sponsor details and you submit it to TGA and they'll put it on their system. There's a question on how does TGA regulate changes on devices included on the ARTG? So for most devices that have been accepted because of the CE certification, you don't actually need to do anything if there's anything changed to the device, because that's dealt with by the notified body. However, if the change results in a new CE certificate, you just need to file that with TGA as an updated manufacturer evidence. It's slightly different with Class 3s because they have an additional requirement to have a design examination certificate for some Class 3 devices. And in that case, if there is a significant change to the product, you will need to do a device variation application. And again, it's like the device application. You've got your certificate already issued by the notified body, so the process is supposed to be quicker. It's usually quicker. Okay, I'm just trying to go. Okay, there's one about clinical evidence. So clinical evidence must be signed by a clinical expert. Does a clinical expert have to be surgeon, doctor, or can it be nurse or pharmacist? So as I mentioned before, the answer really here is maybe. The clinical expert really depends on the device. So there are two key factors that TGA look at. One is the qualification of the clinical expert, and the other is the experience with the use of that product. So if your product is an implantable, for example, and it's only intended for surgeons to use, then that's the appropriate clinical expert for it. And again, so if it's something that's not used, if it's a low-risk product and it's used only by pharmacists, then yes, it's highly dependent on your justification for the appropriateness of the expert. TGA doesn't have like specific clauses or specific requirements as to who it should be, but you must have an appropriate justification that this is that a particular person is a correct clinical expert. It just can't be a product specialist in the company, or someone who knows a lot about the product but doesn't actually use it in clinical practice. Okay, there's a question on how do we know if the device will require an application audit? Okay, so if for classes that are class 1, non-sterile, non-measuring, it's basically self-declared. So you submit your device application and usually within an hour you can get an approval. For classes that are up to Class 2B, TGA selects the application audit randomly, and this is usually based on their current, current concerns about particular groups or categories of devices. These can change from time to time. So sometimes they could look at a specific keyword, like software or something. But as I mentioned, it's time to time, and it is a random application audit. Usually with these audits, the typical documents requested are labeling and advertising materials and things like declaration of conformity if they haven't been submitted already. For Class 3 devices, however, and for active implantables, it is a mandatory application audit. So key technical file documents, risk assessment, clinical evidence, all of those are required. Now we do have actually a whole bunch of questions, and I'll try and get through most, but we'll go through about 2 more questions, and what I'll suggest is we'll follow up directly by email because there is a lot of questions here. There's a question on what international regulatory certifications Australian companies recognize. So as I mentioned, it's pretty much Europe. So CE certification, they don't recognize FDA approvals, but it's one of the key differences with New Zealand. And basically, no other jurisdictions apart from Europe. For some IVDs, they may accept Canadian licenses, but again, it's a complex area, and it's usually case-by-case basis. But simple answer for that is European certification. I'll go through one last question, and I'll answer, and we'll answer all of your questions directly following the webinar. Sorry, I'm just trying to Okay, there's one that says, what is the length of time for technical file review? Okay, so for devices that are entered, if you're registering a product based on CE certification, there's actually no re-review of the technical file. So as long as the annual fees are paid and the notified body is undergoing these reviews, so you don't actually need to do anything with TGA. However, once the notified body does review the technical file, they will usually reissue a CE certificate, and especially if it expires or something, and that must be notified to TGA by means of a variation to manufacturer's evidence. For some classes that are high risk, this can actually trigger another application audit if there's an expired CE certificate sitting on a file for a particular device. Okay, I'll go through one more. There's one more about just adverse event reporting, about whether TGA requires adverse event reporting, and a simple answer is just they don't require for an adverse event reporting. They are different to FDA in this aspect. So I do apologize that I can't actually go through all the questions live on the webinar, but be sure to look out for an email. We will follow up directly with your questions. A copy of the presentation slides as well as the recording will be made available as well shortly after. And if you do have any other questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. Either shoot us an email at help@brownwoodbiomedical.com or give us a call in our office. The number's right there. It's 9906-2984. And thank you everyone for joining the webinar. I do hope you found it useful. And as I mentioned before, any questions, please don't hesitate to shoot us an email. So thank you once again, and have a lovely day, everyone.